Hello, hello.
Hello, gentlemen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Cyrus, can you hear me? Cool. Now, before the chances are we're going to have Rudyard Lynch join us. Now, Rudyard does alternative history. That's his thing. If he does join us, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Cold War with Ian, and then which departure points things could have turned out quite differently. If he doesn't join us, I'll just talk to Ian about the Cold War. But fundamentally, we're talking about the last decade of the Cold War. That's basically what we're going to talk about. All right. Either way, if he joins us, we'll do how things could have been different. If he doesn't, I might introduce some of those concepts, but we're not going to go into depth because he's the alternative history guy. All right. And we'll just have a nice little cozy chat. Now, considering this is 10 American presidents, this is the Cold War from the Americans' perspective, Ian. Yeah. So it won't quite be what we just did like last week. All right.
Yeah.
So we'll keep it very much in terms of Reagan, blah, blah, blah. You know, the Americans don't think the rest of the world existed anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, Britain, where's that? Who's that? Europe, what's that? You know, type of thing. You know, so it's just them going, having an existential tussle with Soviet Russia. Right.
That's fine. Obviously, it'll be from an English interpretation to some degree, but
yeah. Well, at least we have one American modding, and we have a British person answering your questions who happens to be in America. So
great,
fab. All right. So we'll just wait a few more minutes, and then we'll be in your hands, Cyrus. Oh, and by the way, just say Roifield Brown, 10 American presidents. Bish bosh bang. Yeah. All righty. You're in Tunisia, are you, Cyrus? And how have things been since the podcast launched?
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, similar. I mean, mine is really oral histories of the Cold War. That's what mine's about. So how long have you been podcasting? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you realise how old we're getting. You know, if you were to ask me without me engaging my brain, when did the Berlin Wall come down? I'd say 15 years ago. That's how long it feels.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I was just catching the end of how Sweden dodged getting involved in World War II, which was interesting.
How did they dodge it? So I kind of know ish the kind of history.
Well, they remained neutral, but they did allow German troops to pass through their country early on, which didn't do them a lot of favors with the Norwegians because those troops were used to invade Norway.
And there's something about iron ore as well, as I seem to remember.
Yeah. It was it was Swedish iron ore was exported through Norway. So that was one of the things the Germans were ensuring that they had access to that iron ore. That was one of the reasons why they invaded Norway.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Britain was on the verge of invading Norway themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Just almost hours before the Germans did, as a sort of, protective invasion, I think they'd probably describe it as.
It's like it's always forgotten that we invaded Iceland as well.
Yeah.
No one remembers that at all. And then, was about 1942, the Americans say, "Look, you know, we'll just occupy it now." We go, "Okay." You know,
Yeah. Or how close we came to sending troops to Finland to fight the Soviets.
Exactly.
In the Winter War. You know, great. Loads of what ifs. Where's Rudyard or whatever?
Yeah, we need him. Listen, Cyrus, let's get going, sir. You know, if Rudyard appears, I'll just say, "Hey, he's appeared," and I'll just take from there. Just say it's just Ian and I for now, and let's go. Ian, I'm utterly fascinated about the Cold War, and you and I have spoken about the Cold War before, but one of the reasons why I'm really fascinated by it is that I remember at least the end of it. You know, I'm definitely a child of the Cold War period, as are you. And And there's a certain level of security in the Cold War. You know, things apparently didn't change from one year to the next. And the fact that each side could assure the other side of total destruction on every human possible level meant that it was a Cold War and not a hot war. And we never had Soviet and American troops or NATO troops and Warsaw Pact troops tussling anywhere. My podcast, 10 American Presidents, we're currently looking at Reagan. We've done part 1 of Reagan, and we're about to do part 2. Very obviously, Ronald Reagan was the president who didn't oversee the falling of the Berlin Wall, but he set the tone, didn't he, for that unraveling of Soviet power within Eastern Europe. Do we first question is a very easy one from me, Ian. Right? You've done
good. Let me in gently, please.
You've done all the work on understanding the Cold War and recording the testimonies of people who were at the sharp end of making crucial decisions. Do you think do you think Americans maybe overemphasize the role that Reagan played in defeating Soviet communism?
I don't think they overemphasize it, but you know, I think Gorbachev is obviously one of the key factors here in during Reagan's period. I mean, it goes back further, and it's probably worth just looking at some of the early events from sort of like the mid-70s, when there was détente with Nixon, which was a warming of relations with the Soviet Union, and that also involved a lot of finance being passed to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the form of financial credits. And in '74, Ford becomes president after Nixon's resignation. 75, the Helsinki Accords are signed, which is then under Carter. So there's quite a few US presidents passing through the doors of the White House during this period. And the Helsinki Accords are quite important because they firm up aspects of relations between the Warsaw Pact countries or the communist countries and the Western countries. But they also put in greater solidity the human rights of people in the communist countries. So the following, in 2 years later, you've got Charter 77 being signed by the dissidents in Czechoslovakia. You have strikes in Poland as well in '76. But probably the key moment is at the start of the next decade, and it's towards the middle of that first year, 1980, where the Free Trade Union Solidarity is formed in Poland, and that's directly as a result of some of these, of particularly Poland taking advantage of these financial credits, but then not being able to position to repay them, and they've been using these financial credits to subsidize basic items like foodstuffs to their population. And because these credits are no longer coming to them, they raise the prices, and that causes strike action. So one of the key policies that the strikers want is the ability to have a trade union free of communist interference. So that weakens the position of Poland within the Warsaw Pact. But Reagan is elected in '83. He comes in very much with a policy of the Soviet Union is the evil empire. He famously speaks, talks about in a speech, and he is definitely on the hawkish side of dealing with the Soviet Union. This is reinforced in Reagan's eyes by some incidents that occur in that year, one of which is the shooting down of a Korean airliner, KAL 007, on a flight from Japan to Korea, where it went into Soviet airspace over a highly militarized area and was shot down by Soviet fighters. And at this point, they also have a different Soviet president, Andropov. Brezhnev has been there for quite a number of years. He dies in 82, and Andropov is in power. He's a former KGB guy, and he is really paranoid about the West. He believes that the West is actually going to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons as a first strike. And the rhetoric that Reagan is putting out is reinforcing that paranoia, which reaches a crescendo in 83 during a NATO military exercise, which is an exercise around the launch of nuclear weapons. And it's a command exercise. So there's no troops being moved around, but it's more about managing the communications. But the Soviets believe that this is actually a precursor, or some within the Soviet Union believe it's a precursor to a first strike. And that there is almost a war over it, and it would probably be a nuclear war. Andropov subsequently dies. Chernenko then becomes the new Soviet leader. He only lasts a year, and then Gorbachev comes in. I don't know how far you want me to go into the 80s, Roifield.
Let's pause there. Let's pause there, because we have to give this very much an American kind of flavor. So you've taken us up to the death of Chernenko, and we're about to have Brezhnev. We've had this weird period.
We're just about to have Gorbachev.
Sorry. Yeah, we've had Brezhnev, we've had Andropov, we have Chernenko, and we're about to have Gorbachev. Yeah. Ronald Reagan, before he becomes the president of the United States, is a fierce anti-communist. Mm-hmm. In our conversations before, you talked about Reagan's mellowing of his position towards the Soviet Union. Could you tell us about that point when his personal feelings on how to, let's say, defeat or have an accommodation with the Soviets? It's become apparent that basically Reagan has changed his mind, and American foreign policy will then reflect that.
Yeah, I think it's apparent that he's fearful of a nuclear exchange, and has always been fearful of a nuclear exchange. So he's been an anti-communist, but he's fearful of the use of nuclear weapons. And with the Able Archer exercise that I described, the Americans become aware how paranoid the Soviets are. They didn't really realize at that point how paranoid they were. There was a KGB Operation Ryan, which had been ordered by Andropov, which was basically for all Soviet agents in the West to keep an eye for any unusual activity. And this was, really amplified in that run up to the Able Archer exercise. But the British have a double agent in the Soviet embassy in the UK who's the head of the KGB operation in the UK, and he feeds back to MI6 and subsequently goes to the Americans how the real Soviet view of the American posturing at that time around evil empire and all the rhetoric that Reagan's coming out with. Now that is fed back to Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, who is the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, and she is great buddies with Reagan. They have a very similar view on economics, slightly differing views on some other areas, but generally they are of the same mold, and they get on really well. And through Thatcher, Thatcher meets with Gorbachev before he becomes leader of the Soviet Union, although it's believed that he may well become leader when Chernenko passes away. And one of the key things that comes out of that meeting is Thatcher says, Gorbachev is a man I can do business with, meaning we could have much more normalized relations with the Soviet Union through Gorbachev. He seems to be a liberal. He seems to want to change things in the Soviet Union. She communicates that to Reagan, and Reagan then sees that as an opportunity to bring down these tensions and to, see if he can bring change in the Soviet Union, and also reduce the fear of nuclear weapons as well.
What was Reagan's first meeting with Gorbachev? Where did they meet, and how did that meeting go?
They had a meeting. Oh, now you're asking me. I think they had a meeting in Switzerland first of all, and Reagan and it's in winter, and Gorbachev turns up in this big coat and he's got all these layers on, and Reagan famously steps out just in a suit to shake his hands. And Reagan is very much the elder statesman. He is in his 70s at this point, but they get on really well. I mean, they really do get on well. Gorbachev has, his wife is even in a different mold to some of the other Soviet leaders' wives. He has Raisa, his wife is quite glamorous. He is just in a completely different mold, and Reagan just gets on really well with him and arranges a summit for Reykjavik in Iceland to talk about nuclear weapons.
What other kind of Cold War posturings was the US engaged in towards the mid to the end of the 1980s? And how important do you think they are with the rear view of history?
In terms of the Gorbachev era, early Gorbachev
yes, because we always think of the end of the Cold War primarily with the friendship, or at least the relationship, between Reagan and Gorbachev. And but the Cold War was fought on multiple fronts, wasn't it? It was fought in Africa. Arguably, it was fought in Afghanistan. There were proxy positions in the Middle East and also in Central America. So I just wanted to have a sense of American kind of involvement, let's say, in Nicaragua, as a way of understanding the Cold War.
Well, yeah, you're right. There are these proxy wars, and in Nicaragua, there are the Sandinistas have gained power, who are a left-wing government, and Reagan is trying to overturn them by using a force of mercenaries that are being paid by the US. There's also, a situation where in Grenada as well, which is famously where there was quite a bit of a falling out, well, not a bit of a falling out, but a falling out with Margaret Thatcher, where a left-wing government had come to power in a Commonwealth country. So a former area of the British Empire, but it was in the Caribbean, and Reagan had US troops invade it in order to rescue some US students, but it was there was a regime change there as well as part of that, and Thatcher was livid because she didn't know that this was going to happen, and this was a Commonwealth country where the Queen was technically still the head of state. But there were other wars going on, Angola, as you've mentioned. And what I didn't mention, which is obviously key to this overall relationship, is the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. I think it's December 79 or early 80, had invaded Afghanistan as well, which had really soured relations. That was really the ultimate nail in the coffin for détente. Was that invasion, and it was at a time when Brezhnev was probably not at the top of his game by any means, and it was influenced much more by other people behind the scenes.
So at what point do does Reagan and the Americans realize that really the temperature of the Cold War has crumbs? Where was it? Can't get any colder than the Cold War, can it? But the Cold War is thawing. There you go. That's the metaphor I was searching for. That this isn't just a case of two men that apparently can get on. This isn't just a case of a new Soviet leadership and a new style, but actually substantively, this is very different. And that actually there could be major changes throughout the world because of what's happening in the Soviet Union. When do Reagan and the Americans realize this really is a new, potentially world order that they're dealing with?
When they see some of the new policies being brought in by Gorbachev. I mean, he comes in with perestroika, which is by no means free speech, but certainly a more liberal way of working in the Soviet Union, and he attempts to restructure some of the industries there. I mean, as with a lot of leaders, they come in, and that's the time when they actually see the books, and he can see that the finances don't look great. And the other background to this is Reagan is keen to develop a weapons system which is nicknamed Star Wars, which is the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is an anti-ballistic missile system. And the Soviets are quite worried about this because if it's effective, it means that nuclear deterrence has disappeared, because the Americans could destroy an incoming nuclear attack using this weapons system. And they can't believe, or the Soviet Union just thinks we just don't have the technology to be able to build something like this. So the Soviet Union's fallen behind on the technological side as well. Computerization and digital technology has moved massively ahead. I mean, albeit it's 1980s technology, it's nowhere near what we see nowadays. But the dependence on that has given the US a massive advantage, and indeed Reagan actually offers the Soviets some of the SDI technology as part of a deal to start a reduction in nuclear weapons.
Why, historically, when we think of the end of the Cold War and kind of emotionally, we think of it really happening in 1989, though the Soviet Union lasts for a few more years after that. Why do you think that the American Secret Service was so unaware as to how close the world was to the end of communism in Europe?
I mean, as you sort of intimated there, I mean, these Eastern European countries, the Warsaw Pact countries and the Soviet Union, were quite heavily in debt to the West, and they were using this to provide massive subsidies to their populations to try and keep those populations happy. But that was not necessarily proving effective. In Poland, despite the suppression of Solidarity in 1981, the Polish government decides that we've got to negotiate with Solidarity and we've got to invite them into government. So there is a semi-democratic election in June 1989 where Solidarity can't be elected to all the seats, but in those seats that it is allowed to be elected to, they win a landslide there. And it's quite a clever ploy from the leader of the Communist Party in Poland, General Jaruzelski at that time, because it then implicates Solidarity in any further price rises or economic upset that's going to impact the population. So it's quite a clever play. And also in Hungary, another Warsaw Pact country, a much more liberal communist leader has appeared. And in June 1989, Hungary decides to dismantle the border defenses next to Austria. Now, Hungary is a very popular holiday destination for the East Germans. And so thousands of East Germans go on holiday in Hungary and then cross the border into Austria and are then given asylum in West Germany. So East Germany is facing a situation which it's not seen since 1961, which is when the Berlin Wall and the border was sealed with West Germany, with a huge loss of its population to West Germany. So that starts to crumble. There's popular unrest then in East Germany as well, with demonstrations in October and November time. But there's always that fear that there's going to be a Tiananmen Square response from the East German government. And Tiananmen Square was when in June 1989, there was a big dissident movement organized by students who were mainly camped in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And the Chinese government brought out the army and killed hundreds, if not thousands of people to put that down. And so there was a fear that that was going to happen. But historically, what had normally happened in these countries, if there'd been any unrest, is the Soviet Union would be called in, or the Soviet army would be called out of their barracks, and they would suppress those uprisings. But Gorbachev's view was that he didn't want to do that. He needed to keep a friendly face with the West. He needed to keep that finance there, and he needed to, continue to be on the liberal side of the West. And it's famous that his foreign secretary, or equivalent of foreign secretary,
Gromyko.
No, it wasn't Gromyko. It was somebody else. So it might not have been his foreign secretary, but it was one of his ministers. Okay. Says, we're not going to follow the Brezhnev doctrine anymore, which was basically send in the tanks whenever there's any trouble. He said, we're now going to follow the Sinatra doctrine, and we're going to let them do it their way.
Awesome. So when was the American military, the American Secret Service, and it would have been Bush in '89, were they waiting for Soviet tanks to roll into Europe?
There was a fear of that. I think there was a fear of civil war in some of these countries in East Germany. And indeed, that's what happened in Romania, really, in December 1989. But I don't think anybody realized the speed at which these countries, and almost all of the Warsaw Pact countries, indeed, I think all of them actually, went from being communist to being some form of social democracy from June '89 onwards. And the bulk of them were probably in the 2-month period between November and December 1989. So I don't think there was an anticipation. I think there was a feeling that something was up and that there were some changes there. But I'm not sure the West had huge insight into, and Gorbachev's view that he wasn't going to send tanks in until they obviously heard that phrase from that minister.
I can't believe I said Andrei Gromyko when I meant Shevardnadze. Edward Shevardnadze is exactly who I meant in terms of his Soviet.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was him either. I think it might have been one of his press spokesmen. Okay. I could be wrong. Somebody will tell us on chat. Somebody tell us on chat who it is.
But he was running Soviet foreign policy at that point anyway. So, right. The Americans are caught flat-footed. If you had to think of an American president who needs to take credit for ending the Cold War, it has to be Reagan, doesn't it? The war comes down under Bush. Bush deals with the utter tail end of the Soviet system unraveling, and has a measured response to that. We have Nixon, who kind of really starts détente, but really, this is if any American head of state needs to take the credit for this, it is Reagan, isn't it? He gives that great speech as well, doesn't he? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down these walls.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he does. He does. I mean, well, as everybody's whoever's seen a Reagan speech, you can tell he's an actor. He delivers his lines perfectly. I think you're right. I mean, what I find really interesting about the Reagan era is that transformation in his view, almost from one pole to another pole, you know, in magnitude, where he's, you know, feels he can do a deal with Gorbachev. I think he's also got an eye on making his name in history, as probably any president has to some degree. And he's apparently influenced by watching the film The Day After, which was a movie that was produced, I think, by HBO or one of the TV channels in the US, which showed the effects of a nuclear attack on a city, I think, in Kansas. In the UK, there was another film made called Threads, which some UK people might be more familiar with, and it's along the same theme. It's sort of showing the destruction of a city and nuclear winter and all of the awfulness that would come after that. And apparently he's quite impacted by that as well, which gives him sort of, or appears to give him, quite a passion to actually make his mark on history. And at one point he is talking to Gorbachev about the abolition of all nuclear weapons, which, if that had come off, you know, everybody would know the name of Reagan. It, you know, it wouldn't just be us Cold War geeks, you know, who were interested in this period. He would, you know, I don't know who he'd be up there with, but you know, it would be a, you know, you just think what the world would be like then.
We have a few questions, and I will jump in, sir, and then maybe you'll do a few questions and we can have another bit of a chat. Mitch Hampton says, I hope this isn't too far off topic, a question, but what do you make of the enormous change in perception of the Cold War? For example, a sort of consensus where left and right in the US were generally opposed to those regimes, whereas now there is a resurgence in some quarters of even Stalinism, ! And there is less consciousness of the history of the Cold War. Thank you.
I think there is less consciousness of the history of the Cold War. I think you're right. I'll start at the bottom first, but certainly through the podcast, I'm finding people more interested in it. And I think that's through popular culture, because you've got series like The Americans set in Reagan era, 1980s, the espionage series. You've got series like Deutschland 83, which is a German series, which I think has been shown in the US as well. You've got various spy movies, Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. You know, it's become quite a common area for movies and TV series, and maybe that's because I'm very fond of that era that I pick up on it more than perhaps other people. But it is a shame that, you know, some people aren't aware or understanding the Cold War, because I think there is a correlation with the situation that we're in with Putin and Russia at the moment. And you know, that the history needs to go back even further, because you know, in my view, with Russia, that memory of the Great Patriotic War, as they call World War II, and their massive losses there, is absolutely seared into their collective memory. And there is a real paranoia of that happening again. And now that NATO is right on their borders, that feels, and I'm probably understating it for them, it feels very uncomfortable for them. So, you know, and that, you know, it's important to know about the Cold War as to how we got to various places. I mean, you know, in terms of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, you know, the West financed them against the Soviet Union, and a lot of their training came from the CIA, and some of that could be directly related to some of the, you know, the terrorist organizations we see nowadays. But there was a consensus because there was one enemy, really. It was, as Roifield said right at the top, it was simpler times. It was really the West versus the Soviet Union, with some proxy wars there, but a confrontation between those two ideologies. And although religious fundamentalism was there, it didn't really surface because of the authoritarian nature of the Soviet Union. Obviously, once the Soviet Union began to crumble, then the nationalism and the religious divides in that massive nation began to surface and cause various civil wars and troubles that we still see to today.
Matt Breen, good friend of mine, does a very good podcast, the Exploration podcast. Do you think Putin would love to have the Soviet Union to have survived intact?
Interesting question. I mean, Putin served in the KGB in East Germany and was in East Germany when the Berlin Wall opened. And depending on who you read and what you believe, a lot of his contacts that allowed him to become leader in the Soviet Union were through his what in the UK we would call the old boy network of his colleagues there. I think I'm not sure he would have wanted the Soviet Union to survive intact, because there did need to be a restructuring of Russia, and that was very painful for the Russian population and did in fact happen during the 1990s. But it was a very bumpy road, and indeed the Russian economy is not in a brilliant position at the moment, from what I understand. But I think he would have wanted a period of economic reconstruction. And I don't think he would have necessarily wanted the Soviet Union in its political state to have survived. But I think having that empire, possibly, yes.
Matt Breen again. Elaine Kennedy. Do you think that there has been a cultural forgetting in the US of just how tense the Cold War was and how great the stakes were?
Not living in the US, it's difficult for me to comment on that. So, but I think that there is a cultural forgetting. I mean, I remember growing up in that period and constantly having that shadow of nuclear weapons overhanging me and thinking, this could end the next day, or I might not wake up the next day. And that might have been sort of like teenage angst to some degree, but it was certainly something I was very conscious of growing up. And I'm less worried about it now, but obviously the danger is still there. There's even more countries with nuclear weapons now, but I guess there's less of a chance of a global nuclear war. Certainly the weapons stocks, I think, are lower now than they were at the height of the Cold War. But they're still as dangerous as a nuclear weapon could be.
Question for me: at the end of the Cold War, America thought it was going to have like a peace dividend. Did it? And should they have expected one if they didn't?
I think there was a peace dividend, but then you've got the challenge of the military-industrial complex wanting to keep their budgets high. So, as with any change like that, the military are looking for their next enemy in order to, justify their funding to some degree. So it's there was definitely a potential peace dividend there, because you could cut back on your investment in weapons, but where that was spent or if it was used, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly in the UK there was a great, a big scaling back of the size of the army, and that continues to this day. But obviously technology has become quite a great force multiplier now. meaning you need less flesh and bone out there if you've got like an army of drones or something like that. But I think you've also got the situation nowadays with cyber warfare as well, which wasn't even part of the lexicon in the 1980s. And then, sorry, you also went straight into the Gulf War, didn't we? Straight after the end of the Cold War. So there were other threats appearing as well.
An observation from Mitch Hampton says the day after was the ABC network team. Was
Thank
an
you, Mitch.
Yes.
Jason Robards, I think, was in it.
Cyrus, I'm sorry, I jumped in and started doing the questions. Yeah. All right. Well, one more, and then I'll get off because I think this is a good one. Matt Breen again says, did some of Yeltsin's decisions prove to be critical in avoiding internal fighting in the USSR? So you must be talking about 1991 and that coup.
Yeah. I'm not sure what his decisions did. The coup appeared to be fundamentally flawed anyway, in terms of its leadership and its just disorganization. I mean, it was positively amateurish. The coup itself. I think what Yeltsin did is he took advantage of the situation to diminish Gorbachev's significance to the Soviet people and show himself as the strong man. Yeltsin was the guy that signed or put together the deal for the ultimate breakup of the Soviet Union and the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which created separate countries of all of the republics within the Soviet Union. So I think they were critical. It depends which way you see how which way they were critical.
Cool. Listen, Ian, thank you for your time today. Cyrus, why don't you wrap up, sir?
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay.
Thanks, Cyrus.
Thank you.